Let's begin our discussion of this question of nutrition. And what we're going to do is first, just to begin things, first I'm just going to lead you through a bit of the difference between nutrition and then also feeding. Much of my work, my degree is not in nutrition. I've done this basically. This has been a need here in the state of Oregon for many years for small producers like many of you, and so we have really embarked on. While that's not really my degree area, it's something that is of interest, and we've been doing it now since the mid 1990s. I've been working in feeding of poultry, particularly small flock birds. Also, just realize that feeding is extremely important in any production scheme. It is the highest of your continuing costs. So if you are, when you build a facility, there might be some significant costs, but year after year, your feed costs are going to be significant. And so we need to address that. Also, feeding should be considered a part of an overall production program. You can feed the birds the best feed you have. If you don't manage them well, then they're not going to perform. And vice versa. You can manage them as the best manager in the region, but if you don't feed them well, you feed them a poor diet, they're not going to perform. And so that's really a part of the overall program. And then realize that in feeding, as in anything, there are no magic bullets. There's nothing that you can feed a chicken that is going to make it perform best. It's a formulated diet, and we're going to go through that as we progress through the evening. So let's take a look at nutrition versus feeding. Nutrition is really all about biochemistry. What's going on inside that chicken when she consumes some kind of feedstuff is there's a whole gamut of biochemical reactions that are going to occur to keep her alive. You are just simply stoking that fire by feeding them. And so when this is very important part of it, but we're going to assume that we don't need to understand all the biochemistry. We're simply going to look at this in terms of an applied, in a practical way. It's important that we understand a little bit of what's going on, but we don't need to dwell on that. So feeding is really about making sure the ingredients that we're feeding our birds are going to be utilized and useful in those biochemical reactions that are going to go on. So we need to formulate rations or diets, feeds, to meet the biochemical needs of the animal we're feeding, and in this case, that would be chickens. And whether or not the chickens are outdoors or indoors in commercial application, or they're out on pasture, their requirements are more or less the same. There's not a lot of variability in those kinds of things for maximum productivity. Also, as I said, your major cost is going to be, or continuing cost is going to be the cost of feed. And the estimate is something in excess of 70% of your total cost is going to be in the form of feed. Now, if you were to take organic feeds or special ingredients that increase the cost, then this number even goes higher. So realize that this is a significant cost. So we're going to be feeding, we want to make sure that we're feeding the best feed that we can. We don't want to be skimping on feed. It's not a good idea to skimp because they simply are not going to perform well. They need a good diet. And then the overall part of feeding in an overall production system, it's part of it. However, as you can see by the diagram, those birds in the center, while we can feed them well, if they don't have the proper genetics, they haven't been selected for a particular purpose. In other words, if you want to produce eggs, then purchasing stock that are either fancy birds, Polish or some other fancy breed, or they've been selected for meat production, their egg production really isn't going to be very well. And then vice versa, if you want to produce meat animals for your operation, then you would not necessarily want to choose birds that have been selected for egg production or any of the other fancy birds. Pardon me. And then under all of that would be management. So if we are not managing them well, we don't have proper facilities, we aren't managing their lighting or their temperature management or number of things, then they're not going to perform. So all of these things are going to impact, some more than others, but certainly they all impact the productivity of the animals that you are trying to maintain. And then, as I said, there are no magic bullets. And when I say that, I mean there's nothing there that is something that you can feed that is going to automatically cause birds to perform better. There's a lot of discussion of some of these things I've listed here. Fermented feeds, they have a role. They may not be the magic bullet you're looking for. They're not going to decrease your feed costs dramatically. They might decrease them a little bit because the birds are going to be better able to digest the feed because it's been soaked for a period of time. It's easier for them to digest. Diatomaceous earth is used oftentimes primarily to reduce parasites, but certainly that's another issue to incorporate a little bit of diatomaceous earth in their feed. Apple cider vinegar. Apple cider vinegar is known to change the pH in the water. It reduces the pH slightly, not a great deal. If you try to do it too much, then they won't drink the water. They don't like the acidic nature of apple cider vinegar. But it reduces the pH, and so there is some benefit in helping to prevent some specific disease organisms that might be in the bird, but it's not going to fix a sick bird. It may be helpful in a process. And then oregano oil or any of the essence oils may have their place, but they're not. Shouldn't consider them a magic bullet. They're not going to fix the broken problem. It's something that you need to be using for a particular purpose, may or may not be valuable. Now, when we are feeding chickens of any kind, we need to consider what are some of our objectives when we do this. And depending on what we're growing, the objectives may be different. But certainly, overall, we want healthy, productive flocks. We want animals that are not being debilitated by disease. We want them to be producing at high levels, either laying lots of eggs or growing rapidly or something of that nature for production purpose. And we want this on all of our birds, not just a few of the best individuals. And so our objective really in poultry feeding is to produce these healthy, productive flocks. If we consider egg production, now this is in terms of commercial. Now this isn't, when I say commercial, that doesn't necessarily mean, hundreds of thousands of birds. If you are selling your production, by definition, you're a commercial producer. And so a commercial producer wants these highly productive flocks. You want them healthy, but you want them to be laying lots of eggs. Remember, this is a reproductive process. Anything reproductive in animals will be impacted greatly by stresses, which could be from the outside, could be temperature issues, could be feed issues, could be a number of things. But reproductive issues are not required for the bird to survive. And so under any conditions of stress, then those production will oftentimes decline. That's sometimes the first thing we notice in egg flocks when there's a problem is production begins to decline. So we want these productive flocks, we want maximum egg production. That's the whole point. And so we want to maximize their productivity. We want to maximize that productivity while also reducing the feed to the level that will maintain production, maximum production, but at the least amount of feed. We call that feed conversion or feeding efficiency. So we're efficiently feeding those animals. And then not only do we want lots of eggs, but we want high quality eggs. And so to do that, we need to feed them properly because that biochemistry that we talked about before, they're taking these feedstuffs They're converting them, they're creating their own proteins, and they're putting those in eggs in the form of albumin and a portion of the yolk, as well as fat to make the yolk. And so that's going to improve the quality and then the quality of an egg shell. And so there are lots of things we want to do with commercial egg birds. If we consider an egg bird, she is working metabolically very hard, the metabolism, that biochemistry we're talking about. So let's take an example of an average hen laying 250 eggs a year, which isn't outside of the realm of production. In fact, that's relatively low on a commercial operation, might be high on some of the more fancy breeds, but that would be an average backyard laying chicken. The average weight of those eggs is somewhere around 2 ounces, maybe a slightly larger than that, but they're around 2 ounces, 56 to 65 grams, somewhere in that region. So if we do a little bit of math at 250 2-ounce eggs, that's 500 ounces of eggs in a year. We divide that by 16, that's 31¼ pounds of eggs in a year. If an average hen weighs 4 pounds, that would be a production hen, generally a leghorn or some of the red breeds that are somewhat smaller, specifically for egg production. That means that she's producing almost 8 times her body weight in eggs. That's a great deal of metabolic work. And so we need to realize that the chickens are not little robots. They're not machines. You don't put feed in one egg in one end and expect eggs to come out the other end. It's a biological entity that will perform to the best she can based on conditions and feed. I always chuckle at some of these Facebook sites where they're backyard chickens or whatever, and somebody hangs a sign around their hen that says, "I'm a freeloader. I haven't laid an egg in 2 months." Well, there are reasons she's not laying. It could be feed. It could be some other environmental condition. It could be her age. There are lots of things that are going to do that. She's not doing that because she doesn't want to lay eggs. She's doing that because there's a reason. And that's what as a manager, you have to realize, is that there are reasons that they don't produce well. If we switch our thoughts to meat flocks, so these would be birds designed for slaughter for a meat product. Once again, we want healthy, highly productive flocks. And production in meat birds really has to do with their growth rate. So their average daily gain, which in good birds is going to be in the 0.13, 0.14 range of growth on a per daily basis. And their final body weight, generally we want larger birds because of course we're selling on weight by the pound, and that means we have a higher weight than we can sell. So we're going to be more economically efficient if we reduce their feed cost, get them to grow fast. And this is essentially what industry has done the large industry has done over the last 5, 6, 7 decades of commercial broiler production. This is how they've gotten to where they are. If we look at a typical broiler chicken, so this is a Cornish cross type chicken, you can see the weight gains from the 1940s until close to today, more than doubled their size in essentially that 70-year period or so. They've essentially doubled their size. And at the same time, while they're doubling their size, they've cut the growth rate in half, so growth period in half. So they've gone from 12 weeks to get a 3-pound bird to just over 6 weeks to get a nearly 7-pound bird. And so that's part of the what we talk about, healthy, productive flocks. That would help to improve our economic picture. And we look at the feed conversion, the amount of feed it takes to get those birds to that weight. A day, 4 pounds of feed for every pound of gain. We look at today, we're closer to 1.6 or so pounds of feed per pound. Now, interestingly, these birds, the Cornish cross, began their life as birds that were produced by essentially people like themselves small flock producers. These were not produced by industry. They were crosses. There was a contest back in the 1940s, the Chicken of Tomorrow contest, because the birds that were available at that time were spent layers and cockerels from egg-laying groups. They're not particularly valuable as a meat product. And so this contest by the A&P grocery store said, let's try to get them to improve this. They developed this contest, and a couple of producers, one in California, Charles Van Tress, won the contest, and in all of the economic parts of the contest. And 2 times in a row, it was an every 3-year contest. They only ran it twice, and both years Charles Van Tress won the contest. And so over the next 10 years, between him as the second place winner, Harry Saglio back on the East Coast, they kind of combined. They developed this thing we now call the Cornish cross. And from there, and that was really the birth of the industry. At the same time, they developed a bird, they developed an industry, and that's where we see these advances in growth rate and conversion and weight gain kinds of things. And so this was through the same kinds of things that you're going through, feeding. We want to make sure we're maximizing our productivity, and that's really how it's done. Now, other objectives, if you're having just recreational flocks, and these would be the fancy breed birds. Now, do they lay eggs? Yes. Can they be used for meat? Yes. Are they efficient at either? No. That's what we have to consider, is these are being produced for their appearance. So we're selecting them and we're growing them mainly for healthy birds. We want to feed them a good balanced diet so they have good feather condition, good body condition, but we're selecting them for some standard appearance depending upon breed. And so we're not worried about them growing fast. We're not worried about them necessarily laying lots of eggs. We want enough eggs to reproduce them, but we don't need eggs like we would on a production flock. And besides, from bantams, the eggs are quite small and not particularly valuable as an eating product for sale, unless you have markets that want specific breeds of hens to produce eggs. And then we can get into the whole realm of other species, where there's lots of game birds and waterfowl that can also be produced for economic purposes that you can add into a crop. They are used for different kinds of things. The pheasants and the ringneck pheasant in the top middle is a chucker partridge are used for both recreation as well as just for meat processing. Down on the bottom right is the bobwhite quail, and that's a wild species in the eastern part of the U.S. The one on the bottom left, that's a Coturnix quail. That's an old world quail. That is a fast grower, fast maturing bird, lays as well as our chickens. Probably better metabolism. They only weigh maybe 150 grams, and they're laying a 10-gram egg every day. And so they are highly productive birds. And then the two waterfowl, geese and ducks, can also be raised. They are a part of the poultry group. As far as definition is concerned, they are poultry, where the other game birds are not technically poultry. They're what's called an amenable species.